Okay. Hi, everyone. I am José Mayub and host José Mayub Path Trips Tech channel. Today interview, it's a very special one as John Locke is one of my favorite actors in political philosophy and even in epistemology, of course. It's a great honor for me to speak with distinguished scholar like Professor Mike Goldie about Locke, alongside my co-host Felipe Oliveira Bergonzo. It's an early career research, and I believe in my heart someone who is a big important name in the study about early modern history. Professor Mike Goldie, it's an honor having you here.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very glad to have it, and I'm always very happy to be talking about Locke.
Me too. Felipe, your turn.
Hi everyone, I'm Felipe Oliveira Bergonço. Thank you, José, for the introduction, and thank for Mark for accepting to talk to us in here. I'm a master's candidate in social history at the University of São Paulo. I'm currently studying the debates over empire in Britain in the late 18th century, and it is a pleasure to participate here. And thank you, José, for the invite.
Thank you. So, guys, firstly, I shall read a brief introduction to Professor Mike Goldie. Professor Mike Goldie is an Emeritus Professor in the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge and Honorary Professor at the University of Sussex. His internationality recognized as one of the leading scholars in the history of ideas and the study of John Locke, particularly in his political thought, religion, and intellectual context. His work explored themes such as religion tolerance, the reception of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and Tory and Whig ideologies, and the Enlightenment political thought. Professor Mike Goldie has also edited several major editions of Locke writes, including John Locke Political Axis, the Cambridge text of the History of Political Thought series, a letter concerning Toleration, and two treatises of the government from the Everyman Library edition. Felipe, start.
So yeah, now coming directly to our first question. In 1960, Peter Laslett published what remains the definitive edition of John Locke's two treatises of government. His introduction is widely regarded as a foundational moment for linguistic contextualism, the so-called Cambridge School. Given your extensive work on Locke's political and imperial thought, how do you situate your own scholarship within this methodological tradition? Furthermore, how do you evaluate the evolution of this approach in Lockean studies over the last 60 years, particularly in light of what you have termed the post-colonial turn in the field?
Well, thank you for that. There are probably several questions there, but we have a little time to discuss them. You're right to begin with Peter Laslett's edition way back in 1960, because it is really remarkable that a scholar could use the edition of a text to make such a big statement. He was doing several things when he published that new edition, the edition which we all use now of the two treatises of government. He was putting it into, as you say, the historical context in which it was written. So he was making a claim that this was a book that should not only be seen as a philosophical work separate from its circumstances, but should be understood in terms of what the author, John Locke, was doing. Books are speech acts. They are actions. They are doing something in a crisis, in a specific set of political circumstances. Laslett also wanted to say that Locke was attacking someone whom not many people had heard of, Sir Robert Filmer. In fact, that's very clear in the book itself, because Locke makes it clear himself. But many people had assumed that Locke was really attacking Thomas Hobbes, because Thomas Hobbes was assumed to be the other great intellectual figure in political ideas. But I think, as you've already implied in your question, another remarkable thing about Laslett's book is that it became the stimulus, the template for a much wider shift in the methodology of the history of political thought. Quentin Skinner, whom we chiefly associate with Cambridge contextualism, he wrote that he thought of himself as simply extrapolating, conceptualizing what Laslett was doing in practice. So here was an edition of Locke which had a ripple effect in the way in which we examined the history of political thought over a much wider period. Shall I continue? You can interrupt me whenever you like.
No. Continuous. No problem. No problem.
You can interrupt me whenever you like. You asked what some of the changes were in the way we study Locke in the time since Peter Laslett published, because of course 1960 is quite a long time ago. There are several different kinds of ripple effects beyond that in terms of the shifts in the scholarship. One interesting approach was to pick up Laslett's idea that Locke was engaged in a revolutionary conspiracy. So there's a famous book by Richard Ashcraft on Locke's revolutionary politics, which rather naughtily I tend to think of as a reflection of California radicalism in the 1960s, that his vision of Locke is a man at the barricades of resistance and rebellion. So he radicalized Locke. There was another body of people who followed John Pocock, J.G.O. Pocock, another, as you will know, great figure in the history of political thought. And here the tendency was to push Locke to the side, to say that the influence of Locke was not so great as many people had thought in the 18th century, that there were other kinds of traditions, which we can summarize as republicanism, that exerted their influence, particularly in the United States and in England in the 18th century. We may perhaps come back to that, but that was a sidelining, a pushing of Locke sideways. Another crucial shift was a very important book by John Donne on the political thought of John Locke, published in 1969, which wanted to insist that we have to take the theology of Locke seriously. There has always been a long debate about Locke's relationship to religion, and I know you want to come back to that later. There is a large school of thought in the United States that claims that Locke, deep down underneath, was atheistic. I find that completely implausible. It seems to me that Locke's Christian commitments are absolutely visible and intended, and they make a difference. And one of the things that I'm always very keen to do in the history of ideas is to remind a secular generation, ours is a largely secular world, to remind people of the extent to which in the past it was necessary to grapple, to wrestle with the relationship between religion and the state, religion and civil society, so that we have to understand what people were thinking about the church and about the implications of their Christian commitments to how they understood civil society and the state. Well, those are a few thoughts to begin with. Shall I pause there?
Yeah.
It's perfect answer.
Perfect answer.
Continue.
Just a quick point about that I wanted to ask you. As Jose mentioned, and you said in your answer, you're an emeritus professor at Cambridge, right? So as Quentin Skinner, and so as Laslett were a professor at Cambridge as well. How do you see that linguistic contextualism tradition in Cambridge today? Do you think that that's still a strong tradition in the history of political thought in general?
It is a very strong tradition. It's true to say, I think, that intellectual history, the history of political thought particularly, is sometimes a niche subject. It tends to be on the edges of history or politics or philosophy. if you pursue it yourself, you will feel that sometimes it's on the margins of a political science or a philosophy or a history department. So there are really only a handful of universities in Britain that strongly pursue intellectual history, where you can, for example, study a master's course or a PhD in the subject. Queen Mary in the University of London is very strong. That is where Quentin Skinner moved in his retirement. The University of Sussex used to have a strong tradition. I fear it has declined somewhat. It remains very alive in Cambridge. But you will notice that I've sometimes talked of the history of political thought and sometimes of intellectual history. And I think one criticism of the Cambridge way is that it has tended to be too narrow in equating intellectual history with the history of political ideas. And I think one good development we have seen in recent years is a broadening of how we conceive intellectual history. About 5 years ago, the University of Oxford began a master's course in intellectual history. So intellectual history will include more of the history of religion. It might include the history of the book, of print, of publication, of the transmission of ideas, or institutional histories of university, histories of scholarship. What were the curricula in universities in earlier centuries? It might include the history of science. So I think we need a broader sense of intellectual history. And if there is a criticism of some of the approach that Skinner and others made, is it tended to narrow to opinions about the state too narrowly.
Great
Thank you,
answer.
thank you.
Great answer. Thank you, Philip, for the question. It's a great. I agree with you because, in my opinion, Locke is stronger argues, theological argues. So, Professor Goldie, especially in philosophy study, what's a principality? Differentiates the methodological approach of the historian and the philosopher when analyzing thinkers such as John Locke. For example, you mentioned the 690 book about John Donne. Donne agrees Locke is not a liberal thinker in my field. But many colleges it's not agreeing this lecture about Locke. Why is this distinction between methodological approach and this historical, both guys, and the philosophers like me?
Yes. It's interesting that you will often find that those who study the political ideas or religious ideas of Locke are more likely to align perhaps with those in a department of religion or a department of English literature. There's been a coming together of English literature and literary studies generally and of intellectual history. But the philosophers tend to remain somewhere over there. And I think that the training of the discipline of philosophy still tends often to be uncontextual. The central assumption is that a significant, important work of thought must be coherent in itself, so that it is our task to examine the arguments inside the text. This is anti-contextual. It is, if you like, internal to the text that is there. And ask the simple and crucial question, are the arguments true? Are they plausible? Are they coherent? Are they persuasive? And so you have a kind of dialogue in which John Locke or Plato are here together with us, in the room with us, and there is no time or change between us. I perhaps caricature. You will forgive me if I caricature, because I am a historian. There was equivalent. Used to be a very strong equivalent methodology in English literature, where students were invited simply to immerse themselves, to bury themselves in a great work of literature, Shakespeare play or whatever. And if it is great literature, it will speak to you directly. You do not need to know about the background, the history, the context. Locke, as you will know, remains very much studied in departments of philosophy. They tend to focus, obviously enough, in Locke's great philosophical work, the Essay on Human Understanding. And many of those discussions are still very ahistorical, and perhaps rightly so. Perhaps here it's not a question of a right or wrong approach, but simply of a different disciplinary approach and different functions and purposes. The philosopher will ask, is it coherent? The historian will ask, why was it said there in that time by that person?
Perfect answer. Perfect answer. Thank you. Professor Goldie, one of my favorite parts of your book contests the English politics. English politics 1616, 1688, religion and politics. Was you broadening the Locke's critique into a wider critique of realism. It's not only Sir Robert Filmer. In my opinion, it's a great debate in political philosophy. It's Locke and Sir Robert Filmer. So my question is, John Locke's attacks become the famous through his debate with Sir Robert Filmer. Briefly, how did this debate unfold, and why did Locke argumentation extend so broadly to other ideologies of restoration realism, like you agree in your book?
Well, it's very kind of you to mention that collection of essays that I published a couple of years ago, which you're generously reading. And I should say a word by way of background that when I began my career, I had no intention at all of studying Locke. One of the insistences of the Cambridge School was to be anti-canonical, to de-emphasize the canon of the great names, and to understand the broad ideology of a time. And when I began my doctoral work, I studied not Locke, but the enemies of Locke. I wanted to understand who Locke was attacking, but I also wanted to understand what the wider beliefs, arguments of the literary and political and religious elites were in the period of the 17th and the 18th century. So I am very surprised that I have ended up studying Locke. There are some very practical reasons why one might study Locke, quite apart from the fact that he is an always extraordinarily interesting thinker who wrote a very great deal. But there are some very practical reasons for writing about Locke. One is that there is a huge archive. There are very, very few philosophers, although that many centuries ago, the 17th century, for whom we have such a huge quantity of manuscripts and of letters that survive, 3,000 letters. The German Leibniz, we also have a huge amount of material. But there are not many people from 3 centuries ago that we have such a big archive. Locke's notebooks, his jottings are available to us. They're mostly in the Bodleian Library. And the other simple reason for studying Locke is that there is a public conversation about him. If I write about the royalists of the 17th century, only a few people are interested. But if I write about Locke, then there is an audience in politics, philosophy, religion, and other economics, many disciplines, who are interested. And because Locke is engaged, whether he likes it or not, in contemporary political debates, as well as historical, that means there's an audience. Those remarks are a distraction from what your question actually was, which was about the royalists of the later 17th century. I was interested in exploring regular pamphleteering, what were the ordinary beliefs of people at the time, and what was apparent in the pamphlets. This is a great era, the 17th century, of the short pamphlet, From the Civil War onwards, we get a huge amount of debate in short polemical pamphlets. The birth of the newspaper, of single sheet broadsheets that could be handed out in coffee houses or stuck up on street corners. So I'm interested in public debate. But in terms of theory, I was interested in what constituted royalism. What was Locke really attacking? And you rightly mention Sir Robert Filmer. He is easily the most influential royalist theorist of the 17th century. It's not Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was very untypical in his royalism. His philosophical position shocked many royalists for all sorts of reasons. Filmer was much more characteristic. He wrote a book called Patriarcha, or the Natural Power of Kings. And his argument was that political rule is a version of paternal rule. That the rule of the father, of the husband, is embedded in nature, natural hierarchy. It is the authority of Adam. Some might say that Filmer had an improbable belief of the inheritance of kings from Adam. I don't think so. I think what he meant was that Adam is the archetype, the epitome, the summary of the power of the masculine, of the head of a household. And in the 17th century, here you tie in with the social history of the 17th century. The 17th century household has not only children and a wife and a children in it, it has servants. Virtually every household had servants. And so the head of the household is the head of a small commonwealth, a small polity, an oikos, if you think of the Greek word for of oikos, meaning a household. And many writers in the 17th century thought of the state as a large oikos. This is the Aristotelian tradition of the idea of the state, the polity, grows out of the small communities of the household and the family. So for Filmer, all political rule is modelled on the authority of the father. And to resist the authority of the king is to overthrow the natural hierarchies, the natural obedience that people owe to the husband, the father, the head of the household. So that is what Locke is pushing against. It's often thought that Locke was entirely novel, original in pushing against it. But much of Locke what says has been said before. There is a rival tradition, a counter tradition, that wish to talk about contract and consent and about the right of resistance. And one of the things that annoys me about the liberal assumption that Locke is the beginning point of liberalism is that many of his arguments could be found in 16th and 17th century revolutionary writings in France, in Holland, in England in the Civil War, in the French wars of religion of the late 16th century. You will find many similar kinds of arguments about the right of resistance, again, on a natural law argument, that we have ultimately a right to assert and protect the bodily self, the spiritual self, and the well-being of human beings that God commands us to protect. It's just as theologically based in terms of what God demands and expects of human beings, but it generates a theory of resistance and of consent as the ground of political society.
Great answer, Professor Michael. Sorry, sorry for the question. It's very interesting when you motivate this to the Locke and your introduction, the debates about the Locke and some Hobbes Filmer. So, guys, especially question about your historical guys in debate like me, the Cambridge coup, which contextualism you are more emphasis the language, the political language. So, Professor McGoldie, how do Locke's argumentative strategies in defend a conception of political prudence that is a stated responsibility from the shape, the conditions of earthly well-being, not merely minimal reflect the political and the constitutional debates of his time? In other words, the language of politics.
Thank you. I think I followed that. There's quite a lot of feedback on your microphone, but I heard the crucial word prudence, and I think that that's perhaps helpful to us here. There is an aspect of Locke's thought which I am particularly interested in, which perhaps is untypical of our usual assumptions about Locke as a theorist of natural law, of jurisprudence. Instead, I'm interested in the extent to which Locke is joining in another kind of tradition in the early modern period of what is called reason of state. In other words, the theorizing about how government should take place, should occur as a matter of prudence on the part of the prince, the ruler, the magistrate, and prudence, but partly because, as you say, part of the function of government is not just an elementary one of keeping the peace, of preserving justice, but it is of improvement, of well-being. And Locke, again, is often regarded as a, if you like, simple liberal, that his idea of the state is a very limited one. It is simply the policeman, the umpire, who is there to ensure basic justice and basic law keeping. But I think that is misleading, that is wrong. For Locke, there is still a very powerful sense, again, typical of the 17th century, that the function, or a function of the state, of the magistrate, as they called it, was to provide for our well-being and to provide for improvement. Improvement is a very favorite word of Locke's. We have a duty under God to improve the natural resources that God has given us. And I also think that Locke, in respect of prudence, is following a tradition of counsel, not council, but counsel, counselor, and the word counselor, that part of politics is about how you advise princes. If you think of Machiavelli as seeing himself, or Guicciardini, thinking of themselves as providing advice books to princes, there is an element of that in Locke as well. And it's a very striking fact about Locke's second treatise of government that he has a whole chapter on prerogative, that English word meaning the special powers of the state. You might expect a radical like Locke to be hostile to the personal powers of the executive. I think the nearest modern word to prerogative is executive power. But here he has a whole chapter explaining the relevance and importance of executive power. So there is this hard to understand side of Locke that is not entirely hostile to the accumulation of power by the state. The state has an executive power in order to facilitate the improvement of the state and the strength and power of the state. Locke is involved in the geopolitical conflicts of his time. When he writes his two treatises of government, he fears France. England used to see Spain and the Spanish Empire as the great enemy, the great Catholic hegemony of Europe. But Spain was now in decline by the late 17th century. And the France of the Sun King, Louis XIV, was the new hegemony of Europe. And Locke is deeply fearful. He's a good Protestant here, deeply fearful of the superpower, as we would call it, of the great Catholic power of the continent of Europe. And he wants to build a powerful Protestant state that will prevent domination by everything that he fears and hates, because Catholicism meant not only a religion, but it implied for him tyranny and implied poverty. And he then constructs his political theory within a framework of geopolitics, which I think is very important to understand.
Great answer, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much. This next question is beginning a transition to the part of our interview talking about the English Empire. But now we'll start with theology, with Locke's theology. Locke has often been associated with an anti-Trinitarian and Socinian tendencies on his religious thought. To begin, how would you characterize the core of Locke's theology? Furthermore, given the strong nonconformist traditions in the American colonies, to what extent was his impact on the imperial world driven by his religious views rather than just his secular political theory?
Well, I'm glad you've come back to a point that I made early on, that it's very important, it seems to me, in intellectual history generally, to understand how theologically driven or theologically framed or theologically informed most of the significant intellectuals of the European Christian past were. Locke is today often called a secular thinker, because it is assumed that his famous little book called The Letter on Toleration was separated church and state and privatized religion. The caricature of Locke is to think of him as someone who says you just read your scripture, read your Bible, and you find your own way, your own personal way to heaven. But I think that is a limited caricature, and I think we have to look more broadly at his theology, his ecclesiology. By ecclesiology, I mean a theory of the state, of the church. What is the nature of the church, and how does it relate with the state and with civil society? I'm not a great expert on Locke's theology in the precise sense of his doctrines of salvation or of belief. You are right to say that he is often regarded as a Socinian. We need perhaps to explain that word. Socinus, if that is how it's pronounced, Socinus was a Polish theologian of the earlier 17th century, and was one of the many people who began to doubt the doctrine of the Trinity, the central doctrine of Christianity, that God is of three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. It's almost certain, I think, that Locke was a Socinian or Socinian. He kept that very quiet. It was regarded as a great heresy, and it didn't prevent him from remaining within the Church of England. His friend Isaac Newton shared those views. I think the chief implication of this is to downgrade or limit the claims of any priesthood. Because if you begin to doubt the divinity of Christ, that Christ is one with God, if you begin to doubt that, then you begin to doubt the authority of the hierarchy, the clergy of the church, who claim to be the representatives of Christ on earth. And Locke was very hostile to any claim about the apostolic succession, that Christ gave to St. Peter and the apostles an elite, if you like, of clergy, of churchmen, the authority over the church. And it's not only, it's Catholicism, of course, will claim that the Pope is the heir, the inheritor of St. Peter. The Anglican Church, the High Anglicans, will claim that the bishops are the inheritors or heirs of the apostles. And I think that Locke shares with the Puritan tradition, shares an idea of the church as being fundamentally the believing people. It's a congregationalist view of the church. If you like, a democratic view of the church. It is simply the believers. As he would, and many other scholars would point out at the time, that the Greek word ecclesia, which is translated in Bibles either as church or as congregation, you can choose which to translate it, and it makes a very big difference if you think of it as meaning church, which implies authority, hierarchy, structure, or congregation, which implies the group of worshipping people. But the Greek word ecclesia means simply the assembly of the people. So it's borrowing a secular word in the Christian tradition. So I think he shares with the Puritan tradition that limiting of the church to the congregation of the people. You rightly mentioned the nonconformist or dissenting tradition that's strong in North America as well as in England. We should be a bit careful because, as I say, Locke always was a member of the Church of England. But I think his thinking has a lot in common with congregationalism of various sorts. His anti-clericalism, his dislike, as I've said, of church hierarchies and of the authority of priests and bishops and popes. It should be said that he was also critical of some kinds of dissenters, of nonconformists. He was very suspicious of people who said that God has spoken to me personally, personal inspiration. He thinks that it's important that you understand scripture, that you ideally need the languages. You need to listen to those who have the languages, the Hebrew and the Greek, to understand the scripture. He didn't want a democratizing that led to uneducated people thinking that they can open the Bible and immediately know what it means. And he's very distrustful, as I say, of people who say, I have special inspiration. God has spoken to me or to my group. It's what he and the 17th century called enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, equivalent word to perhaps fanaticism today, or mysticism, the idea of special inspiration. He is always hostile to that. So he's quite conservative about the formalities of the church and suspicious of the extreme groups who see special illumination. And it's worth introducing here a technical term which I think is very important, and that is the word antinomianism, which means literally against the law, antinomos, against the law. Those who think that because I have got God's inspiration, I don't have to keep the laws, or I can rule over you because I am specially chosen by God. So he is always hostile to those who say, I can give the rules to you because I have a special illumination or inspiration of God. God works through the natural order. He works through his creation and through human reason, through natural reason. Natural reason is a kind of revelation. Our revelation comes from the Bible, but it also comes from the working of our rational thought, our rational selves. So his emphasis upon nature and reason is not secular or anti-Christian. It can look like that. It's because he believes that God works through the creation, through our natural, rational selves, not just through special inspiration.
Thank you very much. Very good. Very good answer. Now coming directly to the involvement in Locke within the English Empire. There is a persistent critique regarding the tension between Locke's defense of liberty and his involvement in slavery, from his investments to his role in the Council of Trade. Could you firstly, as a first question of this part, could you clarify his personal relationship with the institution of slavery and how both his contemporaries and scholars have navigated this polemic?
Hmm. Well, if you don't mind, I'll just step back a couple of feet and meters, I should say, and say a little bit about something you mentioned earlier, and that is the post-colonial turn, which I haven't picked up that thought that you had earlier on. One of the developments in Locke's scholarship from perhaps about 1990 is what we may summarize as a post-colonial turn. Before that, people read and understood the two treatises of government in almost entirely English and European terms. This was about a struggle against tyrannical rule of European and English or French kings. It had always been noticed that there are mentions of America in the second treatise, especially in the 5th chapter on property. But these were usually taken to be metaphors and not of special interest. But from the 1990s onwards, people began to think about Locke's book in relation to empire and colonialism and race. Of course, that turn is a product of far wider changes in scholarly and political landscape in our time. So Locke is, if you like, being pulled along by much wider debates in our cultures now, with our concern to understand and explain the fact of European empires and colonization. Now, in the case of Locke, there is a huge dilemma, difficulty, and controversy, which I don't have an answer to. And if any of your viewers and listeners have an answer to the following problem, I would like to know. The problem is this: Locke is a philosopher of human liberty. At the core of the second treatise on government is an argument about the fundamental liberty and equality of human beings and our right to live a life of liberty and to defend our liberties, life, liberty, and property, life, liberty, and estate. And an argument that just government, legitimate government, depends upon the consent of a free people. So that's on one side. On the other side is the empirical, historical fact that Locke accepted the institution of the enslavement of African people that was now operating in the Atlantic world. Now, one thing, some people try to say that Locke really did not commit to that that is not his personal commitment. I think they're wrong. I think the evidence is entirely clear. The empirical evidence is entirely clear that he accepted, and more than accepted in his policies, in some sense promoted a system that involved the slave trade. And how you reconcile that, I don't know. One approach might be to go back to an earlier point, the difference between the philosopher, the philosophy, and the personal life. You could argue that when someone puts a case in a book, that it is irrelevant to ask what they did in their private life, their personal life, their policies. To make a banal point, it is true of all of us. It is true of all of us in our lives that we might well write a book about or hold an opinion about how things should be, what the morally right thing is. But we do not necessarily live that life, either because we are morally failures or because we have to live in the world as it is now. we make compromises in our own world, so that perhaps there is a radical separation between philosophy and biography. But let's come to the biography. You've rightly mentioned Locke's association early on in the 1670s, when he was a younger man, with Carolina. His boss, the Earl of Shaftesbury, was one of the founders of the colony, the English colony of Carolina. And Locke was his secretary in that role. And there are two biographical facts that many people now emphasize. One is that he invested in shares in the newly founded company called the Royal African Company, which existed to trade slaves from Africa to the New World. This is an undoubted fact. Locke did invest in that. I personally think that that fact is not actually particularly important. He invested for a short period only, and as a young man he did so. I think there's plenty of other independent evidence for Locke's engagement in the slave economy, and it's an over-reliance to depend upon that. I also think there are some rather naive interpretations that say, because I have investments in that, that determines what I write. Many people who want to criticize Locke say he had a personal interest in slavery, so he wrote in defense of slavery. Well, it seems to me a bit like saying that because your pension fund invests in this and this, that determines what you will write in your scholarly books. I don't think that's the case. The other fact about his early association with Carolina is that he helped to write a document called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, which looks quasi-feudal. It seems to create a very hierarchic social structure. I think it owes quite a lot to the English Republican James Harrington in its careful sense of the balance of property. But there is one clause in that work that people focus on, where Locke explicitly says that accepts that there is slavery and that there is a right of property in slaves. He does also say that slaves should be converted to Christianity, but he clearly says there must be an absolute property in slaves. Now, you could argue, again, another possible argument is that this is early Locke, and that some of us change our minds, and that he became radical when he came to write the two treatises of government. Not all of us keep the same opinions through all our lives. The difficulty with that is that Locke continued to be associated with the Constitution of Carolina all the way to late in life. The scholar David Armitage has shown that Locke continued to revise and to have copies of the Constitution of Carolina till quite late. Also, my own recent work on Locke in the 1690s shows very much that he is still involved in all these matters to do with America. My own main project today at the moment is on Locke and Empire. For a 4-year period in the 1690s, after he has published the two treatises of government, 4 years when he sat as a founder member of the council or board of trade and plantations. It was called Trade and Plantations. So he is very much involved in administering and policy advice on the English colonies in America and the West Indies. And those documents show him very clearly accepting slavery and in some senses promoting it. I think it's material that can help us think about Locke's view of slavery. I don't think Locke ever satisfactorily provides a theory to justify slavery, which is very frustrating. I would rule some things out. I don't think Locke has a racialized theory of slavery. He rejects the kind of Aristotelian idea of natural hierarchies. Nor does he follow a common biblical argument about the punishment of Ham, the grandson of Noah, I think that's right, is it? Who is punished for some sin in the Old Testament. And many people claimed that people of color of Africa descended from Ham. There's nothing of that in Locke. There is no scientific theory of racial difference in Locke, but he accepted the institution. He does, in the second treatise, have a theory about the right of control over captives in a just war. And here he is close to Grotius and Pufendorf and many other writers in the 17th century who accepted that if you are legitimately captured in a just war, then you may be made a slave instead of being killed or punished, killed as in conquest. The difficulty with that is that it simply doesn't make sense in relation to the facts of African enslavement, of just war. What evidence was there of just war to explain it? So again, we have a problem. My only small contribution is on the religious side. Locke was very keen, as I mentioned earlier, to convert both Native Americans and enslaved African people. He insists in his policy documents on the duty of conversion. And many planters, many owners of slaves were very hostile to that. They feared that if a slave became a Christian, they could claim freedom. And there are two important things to say about Locke here. Because he thinks that the pagan people, non-European people, should be converted to Christianity, he believes them to be children, potentially children of God as well. They are human and therefore should be brought to Christ. So I think his insistence on conversion tells us that he doesn't have a sense that enslaved people are not human. They are human. They should be brought to Christ. But he also says that if you are converted to Christianity, you are not liberated from your slavery. Conversion does not bring manumission, freedom from slavery. And this enables or helps slavery, helps a regime of Christian slavery. So Locke is not at all an abolitionist. In fact, I don't think there are any Christian abolitionists in the 17th century. It'll be a whole century more later until we have the beginnings of Christian abolitionism. So I simply lay on the table some of the facts, and I don't really have a resolution, an answer to how you put all this together.
Yeah, great answer. And now that you mentioned two treatises, let's go to it itself. Locke's theory of property based on land and labor seems to engage directly with the colonial American landscape. This has led to two seemingly contradictory legacies. On the one hand, it provided a moral framework for the dispossession of Native American territories through the 19th century, yet. On the other, it focused on labor as the course of value, later inspired various forms of radical land reform and agrarian socialism. In our view, how does this theoretical framework for agrarian utility relate to his views on Native Americans? And
Yeah.
does this dual legacy from attention inherent in Locke's own logic on his work was later appropriated?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm glad you mentioned the tradition of what you might call Lockean socialists, because they are often forgotten. It is usually assumed that Locke is heads towards free market liberalism, the right of property, the protection of property, and forgets that there is another tradition that draws on Locke as well. You're right to say that in the post-colonial turn, as we've called it, the argument of the 5th chapter on property is now often assumed to be an argument that defends or legitimates the expropriation of the land of Native American people on the continent of North America. And I certainly think that there is a good deal of ground, literally ground, for that. He assumes, or seems to assume, that America is in effect empty, vacuus locis, an empty place. If not literally empty, certainly a deeply underdeveloped place. And Locke is very emphatic, as we said earlier, about the duty to maximize the product of the land. Locke speaks of waste. His notion of waste is rather different from ours. Waste is something that's unutilized, unused, uncultivated. To leave land alone is to waste it, he thinks. We are post-romantics. We think that it is a virtue to leave land as it is. He thinks, oh, it's a terrible waste because it is not being improved and its productivity is not being maximized. He says that an acre of Devonshire in England produces 100 times more than an acre of America. So it does look like a case for rightfully cultivating, an agrarian case for cultivating empty land. And America is in effect empty because it is very thinly peopled, and native peoples, it seemed to him, engaged as hunter-gatherers more than as agriculturalists. But I would offer a couple of cautions here. One is that in his policy papers, often he's attacking not Native Americans for not using the land, but attacking the oligarchic settlers, the big owners of large amounts of land, who themselves were not cultivating or developing it enough. Huge grants were given to people to take land and didn't develop them. So he argues that they should have these grants taken away from them. So it's actually saying that as a matter of policy, their land should be taken from them because they haven't fulfilled the condition of property. The fundamental condition of a right to property is that you dig it, that you make it fruitful, and you're failing in that duty. It's as much a duty as a right, failing in that duty if you don't cultivate it and maximize it. So it's a critique of oligarchs. Now, just quickly on your point about the socialists, we're already heading towards the Lockean socialists by saying that the state might have a right to take your land if you're not using it, maximizing it properly. There is one little sentence in the second treatise, in the chapter 5, that I think is very interesting. It's Locke at his most radical. He says that in Spain, I don't know what he's referring to, in Spain, there is a tradition that if you dig somebody's land and make it fruitful, then you're entitled to do so. So even if the big landowner owns the land, he can't exclude you if you come along and make it fruitful and make it productive. You can go and dig it. And that is, I think, the beginning of a Lockean socialist view, that because property is grounded in labour and digging, cultivating, then that is the beginning of a right to a full, proper right to property. And so you get in the late 18th, early 19th century, socialists who say they're drawing on Locke and saying there should be redistribution of land so that the big landowners have their land divided up so that poor people can dig and cultivate and make the land fruitful.
Yeah, thank you. Now coming near to the conclusion of our interview, and we're coming to a final section turning to Locke's intellectual legacy. To provide a brief 18th century context to José's question, in a recently republished text for the American Philosophical Society, Daniel Gomes de Carvalho, professor of early modern history at the University of São Paulo and my supervisor, points out that Thomas Paine had never actually read John Locke. However, this does not mean that Locke's propositions were absent from his horizon. In his words, John Locke was omnipresent in the 18th century Republic of Letters. His name was inescapable even from those who had not read him. With that in mind, I hand over to José for his question.
Thank you, Philip, your words and your introduction, Daniel Gomes' paper on Paine and Locke, and thank you, Professor Mike Goldie. It's a brilliant answer in the other question. So, Professor Mike Goldie, I was recently reread John Locke's Political Thought and History. In the first chapter, he emphasizes the close connection between legal and political thought in the Western tradition. Locke is, I think, indispensable figure in the Western legal and the political tradition. So my question is a connection, the introduction, Philippe. What was the impact of John Locke's political philosophy, particularly in his constitutional and the political science, as well as the later appropriation of Lockean ideas in the Western politics?
There's a very interesting debate going on about the influence of Locke. It used to be assumed that his influence remained very steady and that it was overwhelming in the influence it had, particularly on the American founding fathers. But in fact, the reception has been much more complicated than that. As we said right at the beginning, Pocock and others tried to sideline Locke, and it is certainly true that there are many writers in the 18th century who are very influential on the founding fathers of America, writers like Montesquieu in particular. I think I'm not an expert on the later period, but there's no doubt that if you look at the newspapers in Boston in the 1760s and 70s, at the time of the Revolution, John Locke is quoted quite regularly. So I think there's no question of his presence. I also think you're right in your question to suggest that many people imbibed or discovered Locke without knowing that they did so. I've done some work on a fascinating anonymous pamphlet of the 18th century, which plagiarized bits from different authors, from Locke and from other writers as well. No name on it, but it is Locke being spread in a cheap, popular pamphlet. Locke's name is not there, but the influence continues there. I think it's leaping right to nearer to the present time. It's interesting that people have suggested that Locke's present great visibility is only as recent as the Cold War. And I think there's a good case for that after 1945, American political scientists in particular grabbed hold of Locke as the icon of Western democracy and Western liberalism. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. When the Berlin Wall fell, 1989, one writer said, this has proved that John Locke and not Karl Marx was right. So here is the icon Locke and the icon Karl Marx. A huge simplification, but you can see the way in which Locke functioned. He became a patron saint. Just a quick final remark. It's interesting how after 1790, after the French Revolution, Locke's reputation went down for many people, because a lot of people thought that conservatives thought that Locke led to the Enlightenment and the French revolutionaries. They thought Locke was too radical, too dangerous. Locke led to Rousseau, led to the French Revolution. So people who followed Edmund Burke began to reject Locke. And many of the philosophies of the 19th century did not like Locke. Benthamite, the utilitarianism of Bentham, Hegelianism, the revival of many kinds of religious tradition, all of these did not like Locke's philosophy, his epistemology, his politics, his theology. So I think in the 19th century, Locke dipped down and he came back up again in the 20th century.
So the last question, no problem? More questions?
Yes.
Okay, especially a question for me because I like so much the theological agrees Locke, and it's a very interesting conversation. You mentioned stronger the connection between religion and Locke thought, political thought, of course. As a study of philosophy, I take the view that Christianity forms the foundation of Locke philosophy. Indeed, I would agree that Locke appeals to his religion beliefs in order to defend the basic and the foundational equality among us beings, among human beings. Sorry, guys. One reason Locke may still be relevant today is the renowned debate about the relationship between religion, civil society, and the state in what may describe as a post-secular age. From a Lockean perspective, can his religion ideas still have us think about these issues? And it's impossible to maintain a strong idea of human equality without the religion foundations that played such as important role in his thought.
Yeah. I was, in fact, lecturing in Oxford just last week on the subject of Locke in a post-secular age. We talked about post-colonialism, but there are plenty of posts around now, aren't there? Post this and post that. There is a good case for speaking of a post-secular age, that the revival of many religions, Christian and non-Christian, and their impact on political societies and civil life. So we have to think hard about these questions in a way that I think late 20th century secular Europeans tended not to. I think that Locke tends to be caricatured. I mentioned this earlier, tends to be caricatured because of two remarks he makes in his letter on toleration. One is where he says that the state and the church are separate things, and his task is to distinguish them, to separate them. The other is where he says that our salvation is no business of the magistrate, that the civil ruler has no business in helping us go to heaven. Now, he does strongly wish to defend those views, but I don't think that it is true that he privatizes religion in a way that many people accuse him of. He's often, post-secularists, religious revivals tend to attack him. They tend to say that liberalism pretends to be neutral about religion, but that it isn't really neutral because it pushes religion out. It says that you should not bring religion to the public space, to the public debate. You can do it privately, but it is not there. It is not for the political sphere. And I think that is too simple a view of Locke. He has a much more integral view of the relationship between church and state, which we don't have time to go into now. But I think that whole area will probably become quite a matter of discussion. You ask, though, a question that I don't think I have an answer to. Can we have a theory of human equality without theistic fundamentals? I would very much think so. I'm not philosopher enough to explain why, but I don't quite grasp why it would be thought necessary that Christianity or any other religious conviction should be the necessary ground of equality. Because after all, Christianity has spent many of its centuries not at all grounding equality, but quite the opposite. So I will leave it there.
Great answer. In the future, I described the paper about the Locke and foundations of the Christianity, and I share your mail. It's no problem. And Jimmy Wardon has a book, The Cambridge, about the Locke and foundations of the Christianity. I share in your mail. It's
Very good
it's not a
book.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this, many thanks for this conversation, Professor Mike Goldie. It's a great an honor. And Felipe, our final words.
Yeah, thank you very much, José, for the invitation, and thank Professor Mike for agreeing to speak with us here. I think it was a great interview, and it will be great for the public as well. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much for your patience and thank you for listening. Thank you. I've
Thank you so
enjoyed
much.
it.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.